The second session is entitled The Street as Territorial Network, and we're going to broaden our horizons a bit from the last session and think, I guess perhaps in larger geographic and also geopolitical terms. The first paper is by Gabrielle Esperdy. She is an architectural historian and critic whose work examines the intersection of architecture and consumerism in the 20th and 21st century. She was educated at Smith College and the City University of New York and is currently Associate Professor of Architecture at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Her book, Modernizing Main Street, examined modernist architecture's role in transforming commercial strips during the Great Depression. She is active in bringing design criticism to the web through forums such as SAH Archipedia, Design Inquiry, and her blog, American Road Trip. Her current book project is Architecture and Autotopia, a study of architectural and urban discourse from the 1950s to the present. She's sharing some of this research in her talk today, The Street, the Strip, and the Freeway, on the legibility of place in the territories of the car.
Well, thank you again to our organizers, and I was delighted at a number of references that came up in our morning session because I will revisit some of those today. David Macaulay's Motel of Mysteries tells the tale of an epic archaeological excavation that takes place 2 millennia after North America was buried under a mixture of pollution and junk mail in 1985. This cataclysmic coincidence preserved our civilization Pompeii style for discovery by future generations who speculate wildly on the use and meaning of what instantly became our built and manufactured detritus. With Piranesian precision, Macaulay's drawings portray the territories of the automobile as illegible landscapes of perplexing commercial and infrastructural ruins. The vast network of stripes covering the continent clearly served as extraterrestrial landing strips. How else to explain their scale and complexity? The inscriptions mounted on giant poles that occur in regular clusters obviously demarcated ceremonial or processional routes. How else to make sense of their color and variety? Most of the book concerns a Howard Carter-like figure working at a site the archaeologist mistakes for a vast funerary complex, but we recognize as a typical strip motel, signed parking lot, standardized rooms, all astonishingly intact. As Rayner Banham noted in a 1980 review of the book, much of Motel of Mysteries' humor, when it's not founded on potty jokes, rests on the apparent absurdity that the 20th century roadscape would ever be worthy of something as scholarly and systematic as archaeological attention. But another reason Macaulay's gimmick works is that it deliberately makes inoperable the element most essential to the comprehensibility of the landscape he depicts. The cars don't move. Frozen in time and place, they are misread as freely interpreted metal sculptures of animals inscribed with names such as cougar, skylark, and thunderbird. So critical was this pairing of auto and mobility in 20th century America that the simple act of decoupling them might render an entire continent illegible. But properly paired, automobility originated in the early 20th century as a straightforward synonym for motor travel, and it quickly transcended this limited usage. In 1922, the New York Times declared that in the United States, truly, we are an automobilic people for whom cars meant more than transportation. By mid-century, we had become a highway society. And that's a quote from a symposium held at Princeton in 1955. And automobility encompassed the broadest culture of the car, its material artifacts, and its spatial domains. For many mid-century urbanists, automobility was also concerned with new ways of experiencing the world from inside a car, as motion and space were subsumed into a continuous sequence perceived through the windshield. Today, I want to explore how these experiential modes inflected an emerging urban discourse about the legibility of place in an expanding car-centric cityscape. The interstate system has so thoroughly transformed our understanding of the modern highway that we sometimes forget that another kind of road once dominated the landscape, mostly 2- and 4-lane highways, which were neither divided, grade separated, nor limited access. As they passed through one town after another, these were highways that, in J.B. Jackson's words, no longer merely led to places, they were places. And it was on these highways, which had cohered into a national network by the late 1920s, that the cognitive impact of automobility was first discerned. With mobilized perception came a shift in perceptual scale. Individual buildings gave way to the streetscape as a whole, from the successive blocks of the city center, with dense and contiguous street walls, to miles of highway on the periphery, with jagged and perforated roadscapes, and finally to extended corridors, crossing municipalities, counties, and states in a sort of SMLXL automotive urbanism, one that was recognized almost as soon as it appeared. In 1953, Berkeley English professor and toponymist George Stewart published a detailed account of driving US 40 from Atlantic City to San Francisco. Stewart's intention was to provide a unified portrait of what he called a business-like modern highway that provided the most direct route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And he attempted to reproduce the intellectual impressions the highway made upon the motorist, not only on stretches of scenic beauty, but also on the man-made environments that dominated the US dominated US 40 across 14 states and 8 of the country's most populous cities. Here were farms and oil fields, slums and skyscrapers, bridges and billboards, manufacturing plants and junkyards, all of it evidence of what he called a highly populous and amazingly productive country, however overpowering it was when viewed along both sides of the highway, mile after mile, 100 mile after 100 mile, on a nearly unbroken line of what he called ribbon development. This same condition existed on US 40's north-south counterpart, especially along the most built-up section of US 1, the 600-mile Washington to Boston urban agglomeration that geographer John Gottman famously studied. Gottman declares this megalopolis the main street of the nation to explain how the services and functions of a traditional compact downtown were now distributed along, quote, a continuous system of deeply interwoven urban and suburban areas, unquote. With US 1 as the central axis of that system, Gottman notes that ribbon development, quote, has taken on such magnitude and frequency throughout most of megalopolis that one seldom loses sight of buildings, unquote. Though Gottman suspends judgment on this new order of automotive urbanization, he describes the almost universal impression that it was, quote, a monstrous kind of city, a kind of indefinite extension of Times Square up and down the whole Atlantic seaboard. That may have been exactly what US 1 in the heart of the megalopolis looked like. But to J.B. Jackson, though it was, quote, one of the most sensationally ugly roads in America, it was also a thriving institution, that's his phrase, inhabited by 37 million drivers annually. Jackson was particularly interested in examining this elongated commercial strip in relation to changing community values and expectations. If you considered the highway as what he called a human landscape rather than a transportation corridor, you realized that it was a place serving the daily life of the driver, just as older commercial and civic places served the daily life of the walker. The highway didn't need to look like Main Street or the Courthouse Square to play the same cultural role as, quote, a scene of work and leisure and social intercourse and excitement, unquote. Importantly, Jackson problematized using pedestrian standards to evaluate motorized landscapes, as did many of his contemporaries, even if they thought the territories of the car needed design intervention rather than cultural analysis. For Martin Meyerson, who taught at Harvard alongside Jackson and served as director of the Harvard-MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies, the scale of the modern metropolis, a place he defined as a non-hierarchical urban-suburban continuum of equal spatial realms, that modern metropolis had produced a crisis in legibility and comprehensibility. For whom do we design the city, he asked? Man in an airplane, man in an automobile, or man on his feet? Each required a different interpretation of scale relations. The US, he argued, had mastered the art of urban living for the pedestrian age. It was time to do the same for the age of modern mobility. And Meyerson saw no point in condemning the territories of the car, asking instead, what can the motorist see through his windshield to make his journey to work, to shop, to play more pleasant? From this perspective, every driver in America had a stake in the answer. Christopher Tounard and Boris Pushkarev addressed those same driver stakeholders in Man-Made America, their 1964 examination of an urbanized landscape balanced between chaos and control. Chaos was evident in their analysis of the incompatibility of shopping and vehicular movement along the numerous turning movements to which the driver-shopper is subjected on a typical commercial ribbon, created psychological friction that had a deleterious effect on the person behind the wheel. And this becomes their rationale for replacing existing commercial strips with retail islands off limited access highways, which you see in the lower image on the left. And also in both a hypothetical reconstruction of an exit and then examples of kind of before and after planning. Their most detailed analysis of car and driver occurs in their discussion of the aesthetic of the freeway, which begins with an exploration of those factors that shape, quote, vision in motion as the motorist experiences a multi-dimensional world of space, time, and energy. Here, Tounard and Pushkarev consider what happens to driver concentration as vision as speed increases, diagramming this to show how we see the sky, roadside, and roadbed under typical conditions through the windshield of a typical 1960 car. On a two-lane highway, the roadside dominates. On a freeway at 60 miles per hour, the sky dominates, but the roadside is more prominent. Thus, the ribbons of pavement define the visual space of the road, as they put it, ideally as plastic abstraction or sculptural form in their terms, easily apprehended by the driver. The driver's point of view is also important to the freeway's focus, interest, and drama in relation to the design and siting of highway landmarks. To enhance driver concentration, these needed the clarity of discrete objects, not unlike, they suggest, the spires of Chartres seen across the wheat fields of Le Centre. In the US context, a well-designed overpass in sync with the aesthetics of the road could play a similar role. Lawrence Halprin's Freeways is a spirited riposte to Tounard and Pushkarev's cool formalism. Though the landscape architect also believes the modern superhighway is a sculpture for motion, as he put it, he is as interested in the aesthetics of what's around the freeway as in the freeway itself. Too often, he argued, new highways observe the principles of freeway design while violating principles of urban design. And the Embarcadero Freeway in particular, in San Francisco, now removed, is his exemplar of the confrontation between city and highway. But Halprin does not condemn urban freeways outright. In fact, he argues that driving them can be utterly exhilarating. Quote, the great vivid skylines of the city can be seen not as a static picture, but as a series of constantly changing impressions which move by like the frames of a motion picture, unquote. The problem was that these impressions were limited to the driver on the highway. Beneath an elevated freeway or alongside a depressed one was a landscape devastated by the freeway passing through it. The freeways didn't only destroy neighborhoods, they destroyed neighborhood values, his word for civic values in that context, leaving Halprin to ask, quote, must we ban the freeway from the city and thus ultimately the automobile, which has meant so much to us? He wasn't actually ready to go that far, but he insisted that highway designers pay more attention to urban aesthetics and the qualities of movement through space. Because highways were usually designed in plan and profile, he argued, rather than in section, their designers failed to treat them as the intense spatial compositions they actually were. Much less did they take into account what he called the architectonic environment of the structures as seen from their surroundings. He wasn't faulting the road planners, rather he believed they were handicapped by tools of analysis and composition developed for static forms of design. What highwaymen needed was a way to document the experience of moving through space and perceiving change. Halprin's solution was a system of motion notation. Developed with his wife, the choreographer Anna Halprin, this motation offered a set of symbols and a simple columnar template for recording the elements drivers perceived as they drove along a highway corridor or on city streets once they left the freeway. There were symbols for structures, landscapes, and moving things, and for indicating distance, direction, speed, and time, all of which would be accompanied by photographic and narrative descriptions. Once mastered, motation allowed the student of the freeway to visualize the highway experience, creating a representation of the motorist's point of view. Kevin Lynch, Donald Appleyard, and John Meyer had similar goals in a 1964 study that put the methods of urban analysis Lynch pioneered in The Image of the City literally into the driver's seat. a view from the road was, in essence, an image of the highway, but not, they noted, how the highway looked from outside, because this was beyond their stated purview to examine, quote, the visual and aesthetic experience of driving on the road, unquote. Like Halprin, Lynch and his co-authors present a system for recording the experience of highway motion in space that can be used to analyze existing highways or to design new ones. To this end, they document a trip on the Northeast Expressway, the Boston area portion of US 1, and they prepare an imaginary design for the notorious Central Artery, which was then in planning stages. The authors begin by rejecting the notion that ugly roads are often taken to be one price of civilization, and by offering a provocative interpretation of the highway's potential to become a work of art. Road watching is a delight, they claimed, and even ugly roads had special visual qualities that drivers and their passengers perceived every day. Quote, a dramatic play of space and motion, of light and texture, all on a new scale, unquote. By recognizing the view from the road as continual visual sequences, it was possible, they believed, to make the car-oriented metropolis legible, revealing to the driver, quote, how the city is organized, what it symbolizes, how the people use it, and how it relates to them, unquote. Creating legibility required a means of expressing legibility, so it was first necessary to create a technique for recording, analyzing, and communicating its visual sequences. This included conventional means of representation, annotated maps, sequential photographs, and perspective sketches, which ended up being the sort of storyboard-like vignettes that you see on the right, that eliminated detail and exaggerated effects to mimic mobilized vision. The problem was that these static representations incompletely captured the experience of highway driving. Motion pictures did record sequences that conveyed the major visual effects of the roadway, but the camera, as they put it, was, with its uniformly acute vision, it recorded much more than the human eye, which would leap from object to object, perceiving each with varying levels of clarity and focus. It was to overcome these flaws that Lynch et al. Developed a graphic shorthand that borrowed heavily from Image of the City and its stress on recording subjective perception of places rendered as paths, edges, nodes, landmarks, and districts. When speed and forward direction that were implicit with highway travel, when those were introduced, these elements were mobilized into a sequential system of what they called approach and attainment that was further enhanced with notations for recording the variable locations and visual intensities of disparate elements as the drivers apprehended them. These were rendered as sequence diagrams arranged in thin strips to be read from bottom to top, though they could also be used in composite diagrams, representing a route in plan and highlighting specific visual elements. The night diagram of their proposed Central Artery route, which captures a transformed landscape of illuminated nocturnal landmarks, as they call it, is one of the most stunning in the book, and perhaps one of the most influential given the impact that it had on Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower in their analysis of the Las Vegas Strip and what they called commercial architecture at the scale of the city. If their notation system sounds complex, that's because it is, and I'm still trying to kind of learn it myself. It was as complex as the highway experience was. In explaining this complexity, Lynch et al. Argued that driving a highway was like a dizzying combination of kinesthetic sensations, of large-scale architecture, music, cinema, dance, and amusement park rides. Those are all of the things that they allude to. Guiding us through this hyper-stimulating world was the automobile, which acted as a filter, diluting smell, sound, and touch, while also framing sight. Our compensation is the speed, scale, and movement of the trip, as we are propelled through the vast spatial domain of the modern metropolis that seems, at least at the moment of perception, entirely under control. Being in a car on a highway, they argued, quote, neutralized the disparity in size between man and the city. J.B. Jackson called this auto-territoriality. Lynch, Appleyard, and Meyer were more blunt. Driving the highway is an extension of self. By the time this was detectable, the territory of the car had changed drastically, becoming by the 1960s not the accumulation of now denuded margins, but the expanded feel of the corridor through which the highway passed. But limited access did not mean limited perception, as freeways and a view from the road so thoroughly demonstrated. And though they largely failed in their efforts to improve highway design by providing a system for analyzing it, Halperin and Lynch and his collaborators achieved something else. They brought J.B. Jackson's notion of the road as a human landscape into the interstate age. And in so doing, they revealed an uncomfortable truth. As socially signifying places, the Main Street sidewalk was eclipsed by the commercial strip, which in turn was eclipsed by the freeway. What the evolution of these spatial domains had to say about our culture was a question they were not prepared to answer. But that was okay, because Reyner Banham was. The historian had been poking around American streets, strips, and freeways since his first visit to the US in 1961, and almost immediately he began to argue for the historical significance of the places the car produced. As early as 1965, he proclaimed that our diverse drive-in installations, he called these the radically new building types that the US had contributed to world architecture since 1900, contending that the visual spatial progression of the highway was a mode of emotional engineering that was akin to the Roman Baroque church. By 1971, he had refined his analysis of what he called the accepted monuments of autopia, looking at buildings like these not only as the architecture of symbolic assemblage, but also as the distinct cultural forms of a mobile, affluent consumer society. He rejected the idea of signage as blight and heralded its contribution to urban character, claiming that it did for Los Angeles what Wren's steeples did for London, and of course, most famously, he argued that the only urban interventions to rival the Los Angeles freeway system were those of Sixtus V in Rome and Baron Haussmann in Paris. Regardless of what aspect of the road Banham studied, he demonstrated a keen awareness of the specificity of place in the auto-oriented landscape. And this is certainly true of his analysis of Wilshire Boulevard, in which he wants to make it very clear that he understands this as a place that straddles two eras, kind of motorized and pre-motorized. But he also wants to make it very clear that he isn't just studying from plans, that he is basing his analysis on the direct experience of driving on Wilshire at sunset towards the ocean. The same is true of his exploration of Autopia as a whole. Banham introduces the last of LA's four ecologies with an observation of a driving habit. The quick check in the mirror to adjust hair, makeup, etc., as a car veers down an off-ramp and onto surface streets. For Banham, this simple gesture had large urban import. Coming off the freeway is coming in from outdoors. Whether we believe this interpretation or ascribe it to smog gets in your eyes romanticism, what's key here is that Banham is playing urban sociologist, and we are witnessing a mobilized hands-on-the-wheel version of the feet-on-the-sidewalk position advocated by Jane Jacobs and William H. White. Call it the social life of large urban spaces. Here, Banham demonstrates what he's learned from Lynch, Appleyard, et al. He isn't repudiating Jacobs and White, nor were the other urbanists, I'm on my last sentence here, nor were the other urbanists I've been considering today, but they were all willing to accept something that Jacobs and White could not, and something that many of us still have trouble accepting today, that there is more than one kind of American city, and that the one that expanded rapidly in the decades after World War II, the automobilic city, whose legacy, whose reality we're still grappling with today, in that city, the driver is an urban figure every bit as authentic as the walker. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Next up is Atiya Karakiwala. Atiya is a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Design. She studies India's development and modernization in the 1960s and 70s, with particular interest in the infrastructural support to India's biopolitical revolution. She's recently presented a paper at the annual conference of the Society of Architectural Historians on the architecture of grain storage and its role in the systems that support the state's policy. She received her Bachelor of Architecture at KRVIA in Mumbai and her master's degree in architecture studies from MIT. Her paper today will expand on not just streets, but also roads, as the speakers of this panel have done, with a presentation entitled Street Paint, Research as Public Works, India circa 1960.
Good morning, and thank you, Jason Morgan, for having me here. Thank you for having me here. So, street paint. So, Delhi is giving finishing touches to a welcome fit for royalty. With 3 days to go for Queen Elizabeth's arrival, a dust-free Connaught Place will greet the Queen with flags, bunting, banners, a black carpet of bitumen underfoot, and a net of paper flowers overhead. So I tried very hard to find a picture of the Queen on bitumen, but that's what's interesting, right? You hardly ever hear Queen and bitumen in the same sentence. So it kind of talks about the iconography of modernity that India was desperately trying to achieve, that the Queen will step onto a bitumen surface. Bitumen, black, sticky, resinous bitumen, the petro product that makes 5% of asphalt, and the Queen. So my paper today investigates this materiality and iconography of bitumen and the street paint that coated it as they emerged in the 1960s at the intersection of the Indian state's road building project and the petro economy. Street paint, or road marking materials as they are officially called in the industry, are usually applied onto the surface of bitumen to indicate the correct ways to use the street. The language of street markings and road signs, urban furniture, perhaps, emerged in the post-war period as roads and highways began to cover larger expanses in cities outside of the US and outside of Europe. Most standards were set by the United Nations. In the case of India, ECAFE, the Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, which is now UNESCAP. In considering this representational history of the system that disperses instructions of how to navigate roadways, I'm also going to try and place it in the political economy of its time. And here I distill a small portion of technical material out of a larger genre of road research that occurs in the 1960s. It's a very small bit of it, and in a sense, it's a very marginal part of the story and a failed part of the story. This research is to produce in producing durable surface markings on bitumen roads, I argue, metonymically represented the state's imagined extensive paved territories, and in its failure to manifest, condemned its modernity to remain inside the laboratory. In 1947, at the point of independence, India had only 3/4 of a mile of road for every 1,000 people, compared to the UK's 3.5 and the US's 21 miles per 1,000 people. Any expansion of their network demanded research and development of road engineering to provide a successful model. In 1952, cognizant of its shortcomings in this department, the Planning Commission budgeted a small amount of money, about 1% of the total transport and communications budget, for the construction and purchase of equipment for a Central Road Research Institute, the CRRI, because adequate facilities for road research were practically non-existent. Being a central research facility, it is not surprising that the CRRI defined the problem of acquiring a robust and profuse system of roads as one of a severe deficiency of knowledge, one that needed a large volume of technical data. In calling for specific responses to geographic conditions, soil studies, and material development, they also outlined the problem as a specifically Indian one. The question that they were trying to answer was this: how do we Indianize road engineering and still produce a modern network of transport? What undergirded this research into new materials and methods was the economy of scarcity within which these discourses were situated. An economy of scarcity necessarily means that resources available will either be too divided to be useful or unjustly distributed. Planning was, after all, a system to unevenly distribute resources so that the multiple problems of development could be tackled one at a time. By researching locally available materials and techniques, the organization hoped to expand the available pool of resources, thus responding to India's inability to import raw materials and expertise, and their focus on an import substitution model of growth. The combination of the economy of scarcity and the systems of national planning are embodied in the research of the CRRI. Their framework of a technologically modern state is undercut by the fact that regardless of research, the state remained without the resources to deploy its knowledge outside of the space of the laboratory. These dilemmas were represented both materially and semantically in their research to create standards for road marking paint. So in 1962, the Flexible Pavements Division of the CRRI filed a patent for a road marking material developed in the institute using pitch as a base. The paint, they noted, had a very good adhesion to any road surface, and the color did not bleed. Paint is composed of two parts, the base and the pigment. And in the case of road marking, it was not the pigment, but the base, pitch, that was the complicated material, which bore the stress of the cars on the road. Pitch, a bituminous distillate of tar or petroleum, is a sticky, resinous black substance that is semi-liquid when hot and hard when cold. This pitch-based paint, they reported, dries out faster than generally used paints and has, at the same time, a satisfactory covering power. It is capable of taking any color that is required. It is much cheaper and under service conditions compares very favorably with many of the road marking paints, as can be seen from this. It's the stripe right all the way on the right-hand side. What was not mentioned was that pitch, being very similar to bitumen, was a material already familiar to road construction labor. It was not a material that required external expertise or new techniques to be taught. And this is particularly important because as the process of industrialization evolved, the idea was that labor freed from industrialized agriculture highly unskilled labor would be part of the construction labor of road building and all sorts of other industry. The central material of importance here is the petrochemical product bitumen, which is what remains after crude oil is refined. When combined with aggregate, it forms asphalt, a flexible, plastic, durable material that has long since paved road surfaces. Across the 1950s, foreign oil interests tried to control the exploration and refining of petroproducts in the developing world with their expertise and equipment. To counter these neo-colonial forces, states like India pushed their industrialization agenda at great expense. It was a time when all the oil in the world had not been mapped and quantified. So inasmuch as the Nehruvian government resisted these foreign interests, the Planning Commission hoped that foreign companies would partner the state in finding reserves of oil within Indian territory. Companies like the US-based Standard Vacuum Oil Company and the British Burma Shell set up bases in India to locate petroleum deposits, bringing with them the much-needed expertise and capital that these ventures demanded. Burma Shell refined and sold bitumen products and was invested in the expansion of the road networks of the country. Stanvac dug 10 oil wells. Stanvac is the US one. It dug 10 oil wells with no success, and it pulled out in 1960, contending that cheap oil from the Middle East was a more sensible business venture than expensive exploration in India. India had sunk a large amount of money into this venture in the hope that self-sufficiency in oil would stymie emerging neo-colonial interests in the region. The office building of the failed Stanvac project, now known as Petroleum House, was constructed in Mumbai in 1957 and chronicled in the Architecture magazine. It was designed by Bakir Shirazi, a young engineer from the University of Kansas, in conjunction with an American architect. With its open plan and modular interior, it is possibly one of the earlier examples of corporate architecture in the country. And although it failed at its venture, the iconography of American imperial power in India was here to stay. These shifting global oil economies impacted the third five-year plan, which was released in 1962 and sometimes called the Oil Plan, given that it needed to balance growing demand with limited supplies. This need came from the clear goal to expand the network of not just roads but also railways to be able to transport people and freight and thus expand the consumption of petroproducts. The highway, it was hoped, would be marked and painted in permanent ways. By the end of the decade, India consolidated its oil interests into the Indian Oil Corporation and consequently exerted a monopoly on the market. But in the meantime, the CRRI worked on developing a cheap paint that was durable and did not require skilled labor or expensive equipment. It also saw itself as providing the standards against which paints in the marketplace could be compared. The process of determining the caliber of street paint was part of the project to create a system that could be easily deployed by any road engineers or public works departments in making decisions to choose the right products. Paint found in the market had to be gauged for the relevant factors, durability in relation to initial and final cost, and of course, Indian paints had to be compared to more complex foreign road marking techniques. Of the 15 paints to be tested, 10 were ordinary indigenous paints, 2 foreign reflective paints, and 3 indigenous paints mixed with foreign reflective material, glass beads. Most indigenous paints used a spirit base, Included were samples of thermoplastic paint and plastic strips to be attached to the road with an adhesive. Transverse lines of these paints were applied across the road outside the Institute, Mathura Road and Bahadur Shah Zafar Road. It's really in the heart of the city. You use the city as the laboratory. The lines were visually gauged every 20 days for a period of 15 months and graphed for their individual performance. A rate of fading index card was prepared, which is right there. Was prepared based on general appearance through a photospectrometer, which they're using there at the bottom, that assigned numeric values between 0 and 100, where 100 was the best and 30 was the value at which a line was declared in need of repainting. The results were mapped on a graph and conclusions derived. There's this 30. The first conclusion was that thermoplastic paint and the plastic strips were the most durable of all, the foreign ones. The second, very reasonable deduction was that the cost of painting crosswalks needed to be considered in relation to its durability, and thus in the long term, a more expensive paint is more economic than a cheap one. The reason this is a reasonable conclusion to reach, especially since the four variables were drying time, durability, visibility, and color stability. But I would contend that a footnote to a graph, to this table, actually undermines the entire premise of the study. So this footnote right here. Test line number 2, at site number 2, which was a plastic strip, failed due to improper application in the field, hence the cost was not calculated. Under laboratory conditions, in a test field, a plastic strip that was meant to be fixed to bitumen using adhesive failed due to improper application and was set aside from the final calculations of cost and durability. As indicated by this footnote, the study didn't factor in the role of the labor in paint application. Instead, it concluded that paint struck plastic, which demanded high-skilled labor and specific equipment, would be the most suitable in marking up roads. So the question I came to upon reading this experiment was, what was at stake in this choice to investigate the ideal over the real? What was reified in the iconography of the painted, level, modern street, the black carpet of bitumen fit for a queen? What made it so urgent to investigate this, and also what was lost in choosing to do research in this ideal utopian space of perfect streets? And so, so appearing in the traffic engineering, economics, and statistics portion of their annual report, of the annual report of the CRRI in 1962, an image illustrates the correct use of the street. Thank you. And it is accompanied by this passage. Studies in pedestrian safety problems are in progress for the last few years. Pedestrian safety devices, such as improved sidewalks, proper signal phasing, railings, crosswalks, markings at intersections, and enforcement of traffic rules have been studied. The image at first sight seems innocuous. It depicts a smooth gray road, a sidewalk with neatly parallel parked ambassador car, that one, and trees seem to be a standard distance apart, and most prominently a checkerboard crosswalk pattern receding in perspective that dominates the frame, on which 5 men and what seem to be 2 children are obediently crossing the road. The image seems too perfect, and of course anyone who has tried to cross a road in India knows that it's staged. This photograph documents the modern sweater vest wearing, road crossing, rule following Indian subject, and in doing so, the image stages this subject. Perhaps, and what I kind of want to do today is like look at the photograph carefully and try and understand what this act of staging is doing. And so the image is set within the framework of 2 simultaneous conditions in India. 1, the democratic industrializing nation state, and 2, the space of the colonial state. So the site is Connaught Place, the same site that was talked about where the Queen was going to come visit. And Connaught Place is an important commercial circle in Edwin Lutyens' neoclassical New Delhi, which was planned as the new colonial capital of India, while the British Empire waned, into which the Indian government seamlessly transitioned. But conversely, the image is shot through with symbols of Indian entrepreneurship that invoke the ideology of the industrializing self-sufficient nation, even in its attempts to undo economic colonialism. In the background on the left is the image of the storefront of Lawrence and Mayo, an optical store owned by a London family that slowly transitioned to an Indian owner to be completely owned by him in 1967. That, all right there. In front of the store is a 1950s Ambassador, a model manufactured by Hindustan Motors, most likely based on the Morris Oxford 3 series, in what would be a long partnership with Morris Motors of Great Britain. India needed the partnership because it did not have the know-how to manufacture the car. And this car is iconic because it was the official state car until 2009, at which point it has been upgraded to a Mercedes for better protection against terrorism. Prominent in this carefully constructed representation of the polity is the crosswalk. Occupying the entire lower half of the photo, it plays a palpable role in the organization of its space. It is through the image of this checkerboard receding in perspective that the modern Indian subject gets tied into the process of production of an indigenous paint. A complicated line is drawn between this Indian polity that backdrops the crosswalk and the will to develop and deploy a successful system of road crossing. First, it is drawn through the narrative of safety. The crosswalk brings together the pedestrian and the state through experiments, tests, and paint. The state's responsibility towards the pedestrian manifests in the zebra crossing. It is a symbolic space of responsibility. It is figurative, and one can think of a crosswalk as the point at which the pavement and the road merge, so you sort of have the pavement that they both, I'm still trying to figure out if it's a literal merging or only a figurative one. So it is the figurative space where the street and the pavement merge into each other. And this zone of the road is both pavement and street, and the two colors being placed side by side are a graphic and iconographic merging of these separate zones. Through it, the state and the subject get tied in this intimate way where the state invokes the road crossing subject and the subject invokes the street painting state. Both are complicit in the maintenance of this symbolic and representational space. A line is being drawn between state and subject. Safety would come if pedestrians followed street etiquette in crossing the road, and pedestrians would follow etiquette if they knew how to. If it were represented on the intersection, on every road in every town. In fact, one of the projects launched simultaneously was a children's traffic park. These parks were not only seen in India, my colleagues have informed me that they have them in South Korea and in Greece too. And they were deployed as training grounds for future road crossers. Somehow by playing in this immersive environment of these parks when young, children would imbibe the language of road markings so they could participate in road culture. Road markings were as much a civilizing mission as a technological project, or perhaps as all technological projects are. But going back to the image, there's one part of it that I haven't spoken about. And it was one part that I don't even think I saw until it was pointed out to me. It is these two figures. These two figures here. These two unruly smudges of figures with their backs turned to us, who are frustratingly not walking on the damn crossing. And it's perhaps these figures, that are like almost, we were discussing, I don't know, an antipunctum of some sort, this vortex that automatically, that is almost erased from this image, that forms the point at which this perfect image begins to unravel. And I want to explain this unravel by taking a detour through fiction. Of course, this entire paper is about a fiction of modernity, so perhaps it's not that much of a detour. In her novel, The God of Small Things, Arundhati Roy's twin protagonists, not coincidentally children, believed that if they were killed on a zebra crossing, the government would pay for their funerals. This is a quote. They had the definite impression that that was what zebra crossings were meant for, free funerals. Of course, there were no zebra crossings to get killed on in Ayamanan, or for that matter, even in Kottayam, which was the nearest town. But they'd seen some from a car window when they went to Cochin, which was a 2-hour drive away. The street painting, so that's it, end quote. The street painting state lurks in the imagination of the road crossing subject, even in Ayamanan, where there were no zebra crossings to get killed on. That is, even where the state did not have the resources to paint. Street paint was a contract of responsibility shared by state and subject, a metonymic representation of the state's robust and profuse network of roads, and Just like that territorial network, the paint did not manifest outside of the laboratory. The Public Works project existed only as research. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker in this session is Keller Easterling. Ms. Easterling is an architect, urbanist, and writer and professor at the Yale School of Architecture. Her 2005 book, Enduring Innocence, Global Architecture and Its Political Masquerades, researches familiar spatial products that have landed in difficult or hyperbolic political situations around the world. This study won Yale's 2005 Gustav Ranas Award for the best book by a Yale faculty member. Other publications include Organization Space, Landscapes, Highways, and Houses in America, articles in numerous scholarly journals, and digital research installations, books, and databases. A forthcoming book, Extra Stagecraft, I'm sorry, I mistyped it, will examine global infrastructure networks as a medium of polity. Her talk today is entitled No Road.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. As is abundantly clear, the street, the road, the highway, while often treated as a kind of object form or thing, is usually almost always an active form, controlling a stream of spatial consequences. And we often talk about the vitality of streets and their role in the staging of urbanity. There's supposedly the linear element around which urbanity crystallizes. Yet we also know that depending on the speed, the disposition, streets and roads are also force fields of values that both attract and repel development, aggregating but also sponsoring the attrition of both development and landscape. I don't have to unpack the cliches of this image because it's already been so expertly done by Gabrielle and others. But in the U.S., we've often long noted that the territories of highway infrastructures have remotely controlled the space of the urban street, sometimes draining it of vital traffic, sometimes creating their own vitality. And while this image is cliche, there's something about it that holds over into some recent research that I wanted to talk about today. Because while, whoops, sorry, just happened to my computer. I beg your pardon. Sorry. Oops. Yeah.
Northwards all the way up to the river mouth of Nguri. Combining the regional advantages and the opportunities brought about by the global economic circumstances.
It's good you get to hear this.
The Georgian government is planning to develop Anaklia and making it a special economic region in Georgia, hereinafter referred to as SIR.
Okay, it stopped. I'll just try this. Well, the reason why that image, well, now it's superimposed. Okay, we'll try going from here. The reason why that image remains is because in some of the recent research that I've been doing, the road remains a kind of economic instrument. Where banks and developers and consultancies and 28-year-old McKinseys and quants are advising developing countries, often promoting formulas that mimic the similar matrix space of highways and exurban enclaves and free trade zones. And these prescriptions are sometimes perverse in countries where livelihoods depend not only on urban vitality, but also wilderness preservation. So in addition to the object form of architecture and urbanism, the conflicted frontiers of infrastructure space perhaps respond also to another species of form in another gear, a kind of active form from us. And this is the question that I want to, contemplation that I want to present. The world's sort of spatial operating system, all the multipliers, remotes, and other protocols in that matrix space act as kind of deltas or governors. So, and those are the things that we might get our hands around. Countering the assumption that all roads are useful, we might ask questions about what kinds of spatial protocols are necessary to generative development or productive development. How do streets and roads and highways become not fixed components of master plans, but interdependent variables in spatial protocols that can regulate development? So development extremes in 3 countries, Kenya, Ecuador, and probably the US, help to demonstrate some of these ideas. In Kenya, the road is potentially in interplay with fiber optic cable and airborne microwaves of broadband. Kenya is the last place on Earth to receive international fiber optic cable, but was also one of the places poised to experience explosive telecommunications growth. At the beginning of 2009, with hundreds of telegraph and coaxial and fiber optic cable lying at the bottom of the sea, some of which had served a well-connected colonial empire, East Africa was still relying on expensive satellite that cost maybe 20 to 40 times its equivalent in the developed world. So, but by the end of 2010, Kenya now looked like this. Kenya has 3 international cable communication connections, and amplified by dense populations. Most of the cell phones are now in developing countries like Kenya, and most of those phones access the internet. Just for reference, in 2000 there were 750 million cell phones in the world. Now there's 5.6 billion, and over 3/4 of those are in the developing world. Now mobile telephony is the world's largest distribution platform, according to the World Bank, and broadband infrastructure touted as a resource that's as important as water. A swarm of telecoms from all over the world are competing for market share in Africa and other populous countries. New entrepreneurs are identifying new multipliers, borrowing crowdsourcing techniques to penetrate the market. Kenya is now being characterized as a potential leader in developing ICT. It's called the Silicon Savannah for the entire continent of Africa. Kenya's technoscape, to borrow Arjun's word, is a good place from which to consider the spatial impact of broadband. As urbanists, we frequently analyze the values and morphologies associated with infrastructures like rail and highway and power and water utilities, but maybe our discipline is under-rehearsed in an analysis of the physical and airborne infrastructure of broadband infrastructure and its interplay with roads. The linear fiber that's buried in the ground revalues land in much the same way that a highway or railroad would, but the atomized airborne microwaves of mobile telephony introduce both new opportunities and new constraints, and a bottleneck or monopoly can develop anywhere within these interconnected networks. Commercial lines of linear fiber, the stuff that's actually buried in the ground, is naturally locates, or the first bits of it naturally locates between Mombasa and Nairobi. But it will also contact remote villages to address other domestic concerns regarding health and education, environment, and governance. And there's, again, plenty of analysts on the ground, plenty of 28-year-old McKinseyites offering econometric, informatic predictions about the effects of broadband on what they call Development 2.0. There are also plenty of entrepreneurs writing softwares like M-Pesa that you've heard about that will use the cell phone as a powerful multiplier. But surprisingly, no one's leading development goals with new spatial variables of urbanism 2.0, even though the cell phone is almost like an elevator. In the sense that the elevator's power to alter urban morphology. It's the new germ of urban morphology that has the power to alter the terms of city, village, road, school, and market. And you know, as urbanists in the broadband technoscape, we might be writing spatial softwares with interdependent variables. Yet in Kenya's broadband landscape, which potentially ripe for both digital and spatial softwares, the only prevalent formulas are outmoded master plans and zone enclaves. Foreign investment supports projects like Kanza Technology City, or LAPSET. LAPSET is a transportation corridor between Lamu on the coast and Juba, the capital of South Sudan, now just being planned, studded with free zone cities and resorts. It would carry oil from South Sudan to a new container terminal. And the country, is now poised to provide some intelligent forms of urbanism and rural development that boost education and preserve wilderness and the tourist industry. And it's adopting a development formula as dictated by various Washington consensus formulas that is potentially a dangerous formula focused on resource extraction. If the desired outcome of Kenya's Urbanism 2.1 is access, crucial is digital access to information online as well as physical access to the information of the cities. Interdependencies between broadband capacity, road, city, school, and village are crucial. These are obviously socio-technical networks. They reciprocally build each other. The digital and physical spatial both deliver information, and in a broadband landscape, a digital transmission may replace a strip of asphalt. With access as a constant, more broadband capacity may actually mean less demand for roads. Roads are essential for access to schools and communities, but roads can also reduce access by inflating spaces and distances for vehicles like cars and trucks, distances reduced by transit, bicycle, foot. In some contexts, reducing road capacity may increase access to community and education. In many sensitive landscape preserves around the world, reducing roads that are sometimes carriers of unplanned development and unproductive growth increases access to natural resources and industries of landscape. In the same equation that favors access, broadband capacity may dial down roads and highways while it dials up schools and hospitals or relocated factories and markets. The smartphone has already changed the relationship between farm and market, as we know, eliminating the need for travel unless prices are sufficiently attractive. The infrastructure for the rural market may now be selling also to a global market by means of mobile phone and requiring access to airports in the port of Mombasa rather than a local or regional market. Factories that used to locate in the zone now might locate in the city or the village where access to workers requires no special infrastructure or housing. Similarly, schools, universities, and hospitals may now have a global reach even in a remote location and may derive some part of their urbanity from deliberate connections to Nairobi or Mombasa or beyond. So in broadband urbanism, access to information might be measured in not only bits per second, but in physical distances, since the disposition of new communication technologies has the capacity to shrink or reposition or enlarge villages, roads, and schools. Broadband rewires and resizes the kind of default matrix space that's often being proposed as an economic incentive. Similarly, in sensitive landscapes like the Amazon, protocols might incentivize concentrations of development that carry the most concentrate development that sometimes carries some of the most destructive force fields for the forest. The individual ranch, the finca, the road, the school, the tourist outpost might develop mutually beneficial interdependencies as the contraction of roads and the development means growth of the forest and growth of alternative forms of industry. In Ecuador, for instance, roads built to extract oil, I mean, we all know this, we've seen how this works, but those roads often become the spine of all kinds of uncontrolled development, depleting the rainforest and biodiversity that would otherwise create and support a tourism and auxiliary industries. The country's also contracted for all kinds of default enclave cities and free zone cities. And the emergent global protocols for dealing with this, for dealing with space, include REDD. We know about REDD that trades carbon credits or offsets in exchange for maintaining the rainforest intact. But, and putting those abstract values to work is really important, but REDD, as you know, is also fraught with questions about how to establish or track the values, and its abstraction also invites all kinds of ways to game the system. Promoters of forest preservation sometimes find themselves wishing there was a market for something else, for some other values in the forest that might be at risk if the market only trades in abstract carbon credits. The essence of the carbon market has also now promoted speculation in markets of biodiversity or markets of culture for individual people. How can one establish different kinds of values that can be traded in the world? The currency of with the currency of market shares, REDD must also avoid the pitfalls of, for instance, the suburban house and its mortgage and in the global financial market. For the suburban house, an object in space valued for many intangibles and yet subject to a kind of feverish, convoluted trading was reduced to a cipher when that trading was exhausted, with no auxiliary valuation or means to recuperate the actual object in play. And similarly, when expensive and cumbersome technical apparatus of the carbon market is exploited or chiseled, what values of the actual spatial antecedent, the forest itself, will remain? And more important in the long run, in the coalition of developing countries that all share situations in which developments confront imperatives, what kinds of global protocols might they share? We can look at a situation like the Yasuni protocol, where a portion of the forest, the ITT block, is creating a kind of cousin protocol to REDD, in which Ecuador is selling shares in that. Is selling certificates that will allow them to keep oil in the ground, since 20% of their known oil reserves are underneath a very sensitive portion of the forest. So it's in this case they're actually trading in other qualities and values besides a carbon market. And it's offering the beginnings of a kind of spatial protocol that truly leverages with spatial variables space as it contains all of the visible, tangible risks and rewards rather than a kind of abstract value. So exceeding the powers of object form or single solutions, we can we think, I am asking, of active forms, spatial protocols or governors that have the capacity to not only add development but also shrink or concentrate or subtract it. And roads are a crucial variable in this kind of subtraction protocol. We might come back to our own United States, where a subtraction protocol may be useful, as it may be useful in many parts of the world where sprawling overdevelopment has attracted distended or failed markets, or where development confronts environmental issues, or where development might be wise to recede from exhausted land or floodplains, where special land preserves are valued. So it's interesting to think about the way in which a subtraction protocol might also offer somewhat less violent tools of acquisition and more safeguards against disenfranchisement in the markets of even marginal informal settlement. Again, it's considered entirely rational to trade abstract values like mortgages associated with this landscape, but spatial properties expressed as functions or deltas or other spatial protocols might be more effective in the ways that they, again, make those risks and rewards more tangible or visible. So an elementary ecology of properties, whether they're McMansions or Amazon ranches or fincas, is a game that might play out through accumulation of simple moves, densifying properties that are linked to properties where development is deleted, increasing taxes and revenues that relieve sites that are toxic or decreasing in value. And when cleared sites organize new enterprise, they in turn generate new revenues, where the heavy industry of subtracting development might be produce a new market and new jobs, new forms of compensation. So finally, the street, the road, the highway is an active form with many faders and toggles that and I suppose my talk here today is just trying to gently wrap our hands around some of those faders and toggles that have many potential interdependent relationships. While those relationships are often in the kind of default matrix space of economic and technical language, architects and urbanists might reassert their arts with spatial protocols of active form. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce our panel discussion moderator, Brian Goldstein. Brian is a PhD candidate at the GSD. He studies the social and political history of the built environment, focusing on the United States in the latter half of the 20th century. He's especially interested in the intersection of civil rights movements and architecture and planning, the history of community development and grassroots responses to urban policy. His dissertation examines urban development in Harlem, New York, in the last 4 decades of the 20th century. He's worked previously in the U.S. General Services Administration Office of the Chief Architect in Washington, D.C. He holds a BA and MA from Harvard. I'd like to welcome Brian and the 3 speakers of the panel to the table.
Okay, am I on? So thanks very much to Morgan and Jason for including me as a moderator, and to the 3 panelists for 3 really great papers, I thought. And I had a clever introduction, which you've largely undermined by putting "and road" in parentheses on the title of the panel, which wasn't the case as of yesterday, but you will just play along with me. The theme of our panel is the street as territorial network, part of this broader conference on architecture and the street. But these 3 papers suggest a slightly different approach to this subject, not so much architecture and the street, but architecture and the road. And of course, Michael Hayes also pointed this out in his introduction. The road itself occupies a strange position, ubiquitous in daily life, but until recently far less present, it seems, in intellectual thought. Yet, as Gabriel Esperdi's paper has shown us, there was a moment in thinking about the city in which the road itself was everywhere as a subject of fascination, in the work of scholars like Rainer Banham and Kevin Lynch, Chris Tunnard, J.B. Jackson, and also in the work of photographers like Ed Ruscha and William Eggleston, actor and director Edward Hopper, and many, many, many others from that generation. It is interesting and not coincidental that these urbanists all orbit the galaxy of the 1960s. There are lots of reasons for this. The legacy of beat culture, its associated celebration of the freedom of the open road, the search for alternatives to modern form and to the heroic figure of the modern architect, and the new interest in cultural and vernacular landscapes that arose from this search for new forms. Similarly, there are various reasons I would conjecture why this brief preoccupation with the roads seemed to subside, with some notable exceptions until recently. The 1970s oil crisis comes to mind as one of them, as do more recent and related fears of environmental collapse. The car sort of became uncool, although I'll tell you at this open forum that I am very much a car guy, so I was very pleased to be able to moderate this panel. As Atiya Korakuwala and Keller Easterling both showed in their presentations, the history of the road was inextricably bound up with the history of oil as the fuel source for automobiles and the very stuff out of which the road was made, which I found a really interesting angle of your paper, Atiya. The infatuation with roads and the automobile seemed to subside with a broader cultural disaffection with this complicated mineral deposit, of course. Yet, whatever one's personal view about the evil or good of paved surfaces, these papers show that as historians and theorists of the urban scene, it is crucial that we move beyond only celebrating the pedestrian to also appreciate streets as roads, as thoroughfares, and as highways. If we invert the implication of those oft-quoted figures suggesting how much of American cities are paved, and I tried to find some of these, 40% of New York City is a street, we can see such calculations not simply as calls to arms for those concerned about water runoff and permeability, as much as those are things we should certainly be concerned about, but also as a sign of the importance of paying attention to these areas as architectural space. So I will synthesize a little bit and then include some questions in that can hopefully start our discussion. Your papers consider the road from divergent points of view and obviously in dramatically different geographic contexts. Korakuwala examines the aspirations of Indian bureaucrats, showing us what roads might have been had their regulatory ideal not conflicted with the messiness of reality. Esper details the flourishing of intellectual thought that the experience of roads produced. We could call it the matter-of-fact life of roads, although, of course, the people doing the looking were experts, too, who didn't play as experts. Easterling imaginatively tells us what roads can be and what these seemingly prosaic artifacts might accomplish if their power is properly understood and broadly construed. Roads not just of automobiles, but also of information in a new 21st century form. If their subjects and stances and those of their protagonists vary, however, they share several common strands. One is a recognition of the degree to which these mobile landscapes function as carriers of broader social, political, and cultural meaning, whether as a symbol of a modernist bureaucratic impulse to regulate and control in India as an enabler of a new form of subjectivity in the form of automobility, or as Keller said, a force field of value. These authors agree that the road is not only a neutral conduit, but also a vector. It is both a product of ideology and an ideological force, a political object and a bureaucratic tool. It's a source of environmental degradation and a potential mechanism by which things can improve. In this sense, roads seemingly communicate and transmit meaning much like any given building. But my first question for the panel is to what extent the vast, often limitless scale of the road, I guess if the world is in fact a globe, then roads are actually infinite. As the panel title says, as a network on a territorial scale, does or doesn't enable it to convey meaning differently. As just one example, in Atiya's case, we see the tension between totalizing aspirations of road builders and the practical necessity of tailoring roads to the specific geographic conditions they entered. I wonder what this means in terms of the broader ability of the road as a vehicle not just of transit, but also of the transit of meaning. How do they mean differently, let's say? Secondly, these papers share an implicit urgency suggesting the necessity and value of looking closely at these places from a scale as finite as a line of paint and as expansive as an entire country, as visible as the automobile itself and as invisible as the broadband lines that travel along new, often invisible roads that we don't see. So invoking Reyner Banham's famous quote, "I learned to drive in order to read Los Angeles in the original," I wonder if we might talk a bit more about the different mechanisms necessary to read past, present, and especially future roads. If a driver's license qualifies one to read an asphalt landscape, what license might enable us to read, interpret, and understand something as historians like the fiber optic landscape that we will increasingly encounter? I just don't think we have terms for understanding the kinds of things that Keller Easterling told us about, or we don't yet. Lastly, and this is my last point, I note that these 3 papers all describe an explicitly architectural ambition to transform the world by understanding and manipulating these territorial networks. SPRD's protagonists hope that by interpreting the highway, they could improve it, or even use it as the very model of a new design language. Korakiwala's bureaucrats hoped that the language of the road would allow them to discipline unwieldy citizens who strayed from the orthogonal ambitions of the state. Easterling issues a call to arms of sorts, suggesting the transformative potential of roads old and new, if we can begin to understand their many faders and toggles, as she said. Given that we have just heard about the difficulties of achieving such high hopes for roads in the past, however, I'd be interested in further discussion of the potential that they could, in fact, be vehicles for meeting our highest hopes in the future. And maybe we can talk a little bit, and then I think we'll have a decent amount of time for questions from the audience as well.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting that your question about meaning is something that very early on I made brief reference to a symposium that was held at Princeton in '55 that was called Highways in Our National Life. And Jean Labatut, who was the head of, I think at that point he was the head of graduate studies in architecture at Princeton and was also the director of the Bureau for Urban Research, he makes this argument that the highway is the most important nationalizing influence. And so this notion that even at mid-century, that it was still important to create something called national identity and that roads would be the way to achieve that. So I think it's something that people looking at roads have been grappling with, but we've sort of, in some ways, forgotten about it.
I suppose one thing that that I'm trying to emphasize, for instance, in the broadband landscape, is that the matrix space of the city is itself information in the same way that the digital signals from broadband are information, and both of those, access to both of those kinds of information are crucial now, even though and there is meaning in both of those species of information, and they influence each other. They absolutely shape each other. The information of the city can bend and deform the shape of the fiber and vice versa. So that's thrilling in a way to understand the power of space in that situation, and then also wildly disappointing to find out again that it's kind of the people on the ground are the 28-year-old McKinsey consultants. And that our arts, not our sciences, this is not financial calculations, this is not informatics, it's not social science, it's not anything really even that's extra-disciplinary. It's our arts, and it is an art. I think most of the social scientists who are on the ground are also recognizing that their science really isn't a science. And that there's the good ones are searching for more and more complex contexts and interdependencies, and so it would be wonderful if our arts could enter into those interdependencies with forms that are extensions of the object form we're so good at, but that and also extend the power of the object form that we're so good at.
Yes, I saw one of the metaphors that gets, or maybe it isn't even a metaphor, is that the road has this language, and the language of the road is something to be one learned but also designed, which I think you talked about a lot, and was part of a lot of studies in the 50s and 60s. It seems to have moved from that point to the road itself as being this other object, and especially because the project of road building is so national, or I keep thinking about the fact that there's India and China wanting to build roads in Africa because that's like the one place they can go to and for extraction and rise to power. But I think we might have to wait for the next panel, which is talking about roads in protest, because I struggle. And with the idea that road building can be an anti-establishment project. I don't know. I think it's an important charge. It's a difficult charge.
And Well, I was just going to hasten to say that and because I didn't get to make the disclaimer in the course of the talk, that what I was advocating is in no way saying, oh well, the highways were nice for us, but the developing country really shouldn't make our same mistakes, in a sort of patronizing, it's in no way that kind of argument, but it is a struggle to, without judging the forms and the access that they will clearly bring, understand how they might be turned towards more productivity.
But, it's interesting to consider to go back to the earlier point you were making about how sort of our disciplinary arts can be deployed in this sort of new realm of the telecommunication network. Because if I think back to some of your earlier work and kind of theorizing on the utility of the term information superhighway, which is now kind of regarded as obsolete, and yet it's really useful because it reminds us of a thing that is tangible. Because if we think about the difference between one of the complications about dealing with the road in urban theory was that it upended our conventional notions of architecture and space because of the way that it elongated it. And the telecommunications network does that even more by upending our notions of space itself. And so it's almost as if we need to create a way to articulate that you can, in fact, bring your spatial tools to bear on this larger design project.
So let's, maybe we can take a few questions from the audience before lunch. I suppose it would work easiest. Why don't we take a couple at once, and then we can have a little bit of discussion. If we have time, we can take another. Should never make a teaching fellow a moderator, because I'll wait here all day. Nobody? Okay. Well, one. Okay, Fallon, go ahead, please.
Save my fellow teaching fellow. One of the things I found really interesting, Tia, about your presentation was the undercurrent to this research project, which was this interest and disinterest at the same time on the part of the researchers in the abilities of the indigenous population and the capacities of the indigenous land, the territory of India. And one of the things that I found also interesting, Heather, about your presentation was this focus on the landscapes that are being preserved, right? And this interest in preserving that which is already there and finding some way to capitalize upon that. For whom is, of course, the question. And it brings me to this question of for whom and by whom, right? And so if it is the interested bureaucrat engineer in India who can take on this charge of perhaps preserving a landscape, a cultural landscape, and a physical landscape, while at the same time modernizing it, then is that not someone who can be involved in the project that you're projecting? Or is that person excluded from this projective project and some other kind of agent and activist is whom we have in mind?
Well, I guess in kind of optimistic view, one imagines that if there were as many spatial protocols or softwares as there are digital softwares, then no one person, engineer, privileged, underprivileged, whatever, is in a especially privileged position. There's all kinds of players making all kinds of multipliers that are connecting to all those cell phones and all the developments that are surrounding them. So it's, I mean, I don't know that there's a privileged actor or expert, in other words, in this scenario, but just many contagions, many multipliers, many makers. I don't know if that was what you were. I mean, if you think about it as analogous to the way cell phones, it's just like there's new apps constantly. There's the world's new models of entrepreneurialism aren't coming from the U.S. or Japan. They're coming from this. They're coming from Africa and India. Business models.
Yes. So I mean, well, of course, in India it was the state, very central planning authority, and I wonder to what extent their ability to investigate the ideal, which I sort of need to think about more and answer, has opened the door even faster. I mean, I don't think anything could have stopped neoliberalism from coming in, but to what extent that the choice to not think about, which of course then post-colonialism comes in and does, but that gap. To what extent that allows it, because it makes me think of in the context of Kenya, where I don't know how strong the state is, but then you have these neoliberal actors, and there's this idea that it's a very powerful idea that having this completely amorphous network has the possibility to really create a new way of thinking about the relationship to this great force that I feel like I have not the optimistic view on this thing, but yeah. So that I think that is I think that was only one part of your question, which was who is that privileged? I think it's more and more outside the picture, as the state is definitely not the great actor, but yeah, there's I guess the hope for the other, for whom part of your question, there is that hope of, I don't know who it is.
I wonder too if our sort of acceptance of the amorphousness of it is part of the problem. I'm thinking about Catherine's talk saying, water's only going to go one way, and so you start at the source and then you build the next thing and the next thing. So we don't assume that a kind of aqueduct system is amorphous, and yet we know that networks get built, they're not amorphous either, right? Because it's about points of connection, kind of stations along the way, and yet because it's the scale of it causes us to assume, right, that it doesn't have, in fact, a diagrammatic quality to it that we can grasp. And so maybe we are complicit in our failure to grasp the way that we can conventionally understand it.
Yeah, amorphous is probably the absolutely wrong word.
It's interesting as a kind of coda to your talk. Maybe that the new person who sort of drives into the scene, and you kind of had a successive number of people who took the wheel, so to speak. The next observer is probably also now observing not just the visual. Mm-hmm. So it's a different set of toggles. And a different kind of choreography, different kind of representation. Time released, I think there are, there's kind of echoes of the necessity for a kind of time released representation, but probably not visual and probably not always from that vantage point behind the wheel.
Which ends up becoming a kind of tunnel vision.
Yeah.
It's striking too, thinking of Eric's reference to the heart of the city. The body has always been used as the metaphor for circulation, for this kind of circulation, and I would be curious to see what sort of the analogy of our present era is, because it does seem like those circulation metaphors suddenly become much more complicated, and also the architect would have to take a much more modest role, I think, because you don't get these big heroic, sweeping landscapes of roads if you sort of design something that's not so visible. So.
And yet there was also this moment in, say, the 20s and 30s where the road designers did occupy almost a kind of conventional heroics place. Eric ended with the image showing a bunch of the Westchester Parkways. Gilmore Clark was this this road designer, landscape architect par excellence, and there was a notion that he was the kind of, almost this sort of ideal romantic modernist figure of the road designer, which then when the scale of the roads changes, because most of those parkways are, 20 miles, 30 miles at most, once the scale of the road changes, it becomes impossible to assign them a kind of single author in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, Eric, please.
There's a kind of danger of disembodiment, that these earlier architectural metaphors are all very bodily grounded, and now it seems like with digital technology, we all become these detached observers who, in a certain way, aren't living in the world in the same way. And that I think that that's a issue that Keller's talk, I think, speaks to, and that we need to start thinking about the discipline sort of differently in some ways, that we're not really living in the same world that we used to live in. So.
Thanks everybody very much, and thanks to the panelists.